The Italian fascist dictator Mussolini had been deposed, and the day the Allies landed in Italy, the new government surrendered to them. Protected by the mass fire of 600 guns, the 8th Army, without the New Zealand Division, swarmed over the deserted beaches and made their way with great deliberation up the narrow road where one German battalion, with planned demolition, slowed a whole army's progress. All this time, our division had languished in Egypt, awaiting a decision about their future from a vacillating New Zealand government. The final decision, that they should fight in Italy, brought them from Egypt halfway up the Adriatic coast to the Sangro River, to snow-covered and fanatically defended Orsonia, across to the other side, and weeks of bitter frustration at Cassino, and then a dogged advance up through a land revered as one of the cradles of Western civilization, up as far as Trieste, towards the end of the war, where our men would oppose, on behalf of the United Nations, the aspirations of an ally, the Yugoslavian partisans who wished to annex Trieste as a prize of war. But these actions lay agonizing and casualty-laden months ahead. The main interest for our troops now, in November 1943, lay in the transports which were to carry them across the Mediterranean.
Well, the New Zealand landings into Italy took place without any incident whatever. It was quite a summer cruise across the Mediterranean, and in fact the only incident I think I can recall was lightning striking down the balloon barrage which some of the ships were equipped with against fighters.
To the New Zealanders landing in Taranto and Bari 7 weeks after the Allied invasion, there was excitement in having a foot in Europe. But more than that, there was history. History alive and waiting to be visited.
It seemed at the time to be sensible to get into Europe, but as soon as we realized the terrain that would have to be struggled through, a good many had second thoughts about the wisdom of the thing.
We'd only been there a couple of days when it really started to rain. We didn't go direct to the Sangro, we moved up in stages, but on the way the rain became more prevalent as we moved on. Conditions got worse. At areas where bridges had been blown, where we were to cross rivers, the congestion of vehicles had really churned the place up. Every truck had a set of chains. Without the chains, there'd be no mobility at all.
Every country has something. In North Africa, it was the heat, dust, and flies. Here it was the mud, greasy, squelching mud and rain that was so hard to live with. By mid-November, the New Zealanders were in position just south of the Sangro River and had rejoined the 8th Army.
Whatever the positions were that we had to attack, we seemed to be attacking like a staircase. That Jerry's defences were built up and up and up behind the forward lines. It was very tough going. And it was intended that the New Zealand division would be used in the role to which it had become accustomed in Tunisia, in an exploitation role. But unfortunately, the battles in the initial stages never went the way we wanted them to.
The 6 weeks the division spent in the Orsonia region gave plenty of time for a lasting memory of the landscape. The narrow streets and sharp corners of Castelfrentano, the squalor of Spaccarelli, Shell Alley, Hellfire Corner, Jittery Ridge, the Mad Mile, which could be shelled so accurately by the Germans, and where dawdling invited disaster.
The Germans, they were very, very good on tactics. Wherever there was a bridge crossing a river and it was a vulnerable point or a position, they'd blast this, and our main trouble was fording or crossing rivers, and until the engineers came up with their Bailey bridges, there was a terrific congestion of traffic, and Jerry used to come over with his Air Force or with his fighter planes and strap hell out of us as we were congested in these areas waiting to cross. Supplies were our main trouble, getting petrol up to the trucks or supplies to the infantry. We suffered a hell of a lot of casualties supplying the infantry. Yet the peasants moved about in the fort areas. They looked after their animals, lived in their homes, and didn't really know what it was all about.
The Allies' aim at the Sangro was to smash the Germans' winter line, and then drive another 20 miles or so to get onto the road to Rome. But when the weather worsened and the Germans retreated to higher, more easily defended ground, the attackers lost momentum on the slippery, snow-covered slopes. The whole front became a static artillery duel, while both sides tried to make themselves as comfortable as the bleak winter conditions would allow.
You say that the German soldier was more in his element for fighting than you were?
He was more in his element in fighting under those conditions because everything to him was set piece, and he was able to establish his FDLs, his forward defensive lines, and fight the war in the manner to which he'd become accustomed and to which the German mentality is better tuned to. There was only one way of meeting Jerry, and that was head on. From Sangro to Castelfrontano is only a distance of about 6 or 7 miles as the crow flies, and Orsogna was about some 4 or 5 miles further on again. On the right we had the sea just a very short distance away, and on the left we had the higher ranges. I think the name of the mountains there were the Magella Mountains. And we took Jerry on the lower steps of those mountains and those ridges, down on the lower spurs. And, well, we had to get past him, and there was only one way, at him. Any attempt at outflanking just wasn't on because of the terrain. So you might speak of that battle, that campaign, as being in the one general area. It was definitely not a victory. We were there to push Jerry out, and we didn't move him out. We couldn't.
In great secrecy, the New Zealanders moved from the Sangro to an unknown destination.
Well, we tried to keep it secret. The flashes were actually taken down. We had several moves, actually, from the Adriatic to the other side of Italy, but nothing was actually secret. It always leaked out as far as your moves like that were concerned.
The New Zealanders' destination was Cassino, where they joined the Fifth Army under the American General Mark Clark, whose troops were stalled and bloodied in their fight with the Germans. The Allied army was up against the Gustav Line, the German death or glory line of defense based upon the mountain chain running clear across Italy, parting only at Cassino to form a valley 6 or 7 miles wide and a direct route to Rome. Above the town stood the Abbey of Monte Cassino, standing sentinel over the Liri and Rapido rivers, which the Allies would have to cross before pressing on to the Italian capital. Founded by St. Benedict, an abbey had looked down over the valley since the 6th century, a great symbol of the church. To the Allies now, it became a symbol of the enemy dug in the caves around it, entrenched, stubborn, menacing. Both sides had pledged the Vatican that they would not use for military gain, nor needlessly destroy the relics of Christendom. But General Eisenhower, the overall Allied commander, had also said, if we have to choose between destroying a famous building and sacrificing our men, then the men's lives count infinitely more, and the building must go. It was this choice which the Allies had to make as army commanders inspected the New Zealand division. There was no evidence that the Germans were inside the abbey itself, yet the great building so dominated Cassino that its very presence was demoralizing. On February the 15th, 1944, the first wave of United States bombers went in and dropped hundreds of tons of high explosives on ancient Monte Cassino.
I must say that the American navigator left a lot to be desired when, instead of going over the target and dropping their bomb, they dropped them in the vicinity. And the vicinity in several cases happened to be us, and that was about 4 miles from Cassino itself.
After the bombing, German troops felt justified in moving into the shelter of the ruined abbey to offer even stiffer resistance. And in the destruction around them, our 6th Brigade and Maori Battalion prepared to attack.
The Maoris, they were good fighters, good troops. They were damn good troops.
Just about every night, in fact, we went out on listening patrols, fighting patrols, just to find out the strength of the Germans. We tried to get them to bring fire to bear on us so that we could assess what strength they had, what firepower they had. It was difficult going for the infantry.
A good deal of the firing now came from the abbey. The destruction of the abbey and town had been a mistake, because the rubble provided more shelter for the defending Germans and restricted tank support for our infantry. All the time, the Germans looked down from the ruins like a giant pair of binoculars, watching. Everyone below was affected. For the civilians, the monastery where they had prayed became a place of horror. Yet they stayed on in pitiable conditions, clutching their possessions, waiting where their homes had been, waiting for this terrible thing to pass. In the town, it was luck which saw the New Zealanders through house-to-house fighting. They were never sure where the enemy was.
I said we'd better get close to the bank because they can see us from the monastery, and by doing that we walked right into some shoe mines. Well, I got blast in the eyes and on the arm, and I lost my right foot. That was the end of the war for me. I was taken out by ambulance. A jeep came in and picked me up, and I was evacuated that night to the casualty clearing station.
We had 3 600-bed hospitals, and these could increase if necessity arose, but they were actually staffed for 600 beds, and then we had a casualty clearing station, which of course was up more behind the troops all the time. The New Zealander, he's really quite an interesting character to nurse, and it's surprising what he'll do for you. And you didn't really have to have a tremendously strict discipline. I know we didn't have the strict discipline that was carried out in the British general hospitals. There were a few escapades, of course. That's natural. But when they worked tremendously hard. They really did. You were tremendously busy, and today in New Zealand you have a 20 or 30 or 35 bed ward. Over there we would have 80 patients in a ward, and you'd have a child sister and her trained staff plus her VADs. And they'd be awfully busy. Of course, the troops had to help themselves a little bit as well. But I shouldn't think any of them would complain.
After suffering nearly 1,600 casualties in 12 weeks, the New Zealanders were pulled out of Cassino before the battle was over. They were pulled out to rest, still within sight of the monastery. And it was with some bitterness that they watched Allied flags flying over Monastery Hill, without the New Zealand ensign. After Cassino, the Americans broke through German defenses outside Rome and entered the undefended city on June the 14th.
When I visited the Vatican with an Irish friend of mine, one Paddy Malone, Paddy's ambition at the Pope, who was rushed up and down the aisle in one of those chair things, would get a blessing from him. But when he shot past Paddy and I on the chair, he blessed the people on the other side of the aisle on the way up and coming down on them. If I had moved position and I got the blessing and Paddy was cut out again, because of course he was a dyed-in-the-wool man, and he was dead keen to get the word.
Even with Rome under Allied control, there were still many months of fighting ahead. General Freiburg sent a message home.
The battle in which our division is engaged is of vital importance for the destruction of the enemy here in Italy and the destruction of the enemy material. Those guns which you hear in the background are our own 25-pounders hammering the positions of the 4th Parachute Division in the high ground ahead of us. In this hard fighting, every bit of material is of the greatest importance because it enables us to save lives and brings the war more quickly to an end.
The Germans were moving back, and the long-awaited invasion of France had taken place. And although the Allies were battering at Germany, Hitler still insisted on full resistance in Italy. And that resistance took on a desperation that had nothing to do with military objectives. It became an ugly business of destruction for its own sake. The plight of the civilians became critical. Half-starved and homeless, they drew water from the wrecked sewers and scavenged in the streets, selling anything, including themselves, for a handful of food. It was no wonder the Germans became more afraid of partisan reprisal than of Allied attack. The New Zealanders zigzagged their way up Italy in a confusion of battles and skirmishes. They were able to revert to their role of pursuit until Faenza, where they were again held up by a strong German stand in the city. An old lady's repeated cry of La mia bella Faenza was lost in the noise of battle and the destruction of her 2,000-year-old city. The victors moved on, and only the vanquished remained. Those who survived their ordeal found life a jungle until the Allied military government took over to dispense food and order. But with them, as camp followers, came the racketeers, assisted, however innocently, by our own troops out to make a quick quid on the black market.
Oh, black marketing was always rife. I mean, we all had a go at it. I had a go myself. I mean, as far as a normal commodity was concerned, such as a pair of boots, if the Itais didn't pinch them on us, well, if we had an extra pair, which we kept our eyes open for, or probably an occasional blanket, but not on a large scale or anything like that. You'd barter your cigarettes, but I never stooped as low as selling arms or ammunition or anything like that.
Parcels from home were a good source of revenue. A well-intentioned gift was sometimes exactly what a soldier least required. Naturally, there was barter.
The Italian haystack was more or less a safety deposit box for his valuables. What Jerry didn't take and what we didn't take, he had well and truly secluded in this haystack. And if Jerry happened to lob an incendiary over and it landed on the haystack, the fun and games that came from the Itai family, it looked like a corroboree dance. We wondered what the hell it was all about until the stack had burnt down, and then there was the visible charred remains of a motor car or a piano or whatever it was that he had stashed under there. You had to be a little careful because the Itais seemed to want to protect their property, tried to be Johnny on the spot so that whatever possessions or valuable possessions they had, they would be there when the action moved on. If there were the odd mobile delicacies around, such as pigs or fowls or eggs or anything like that, and if there was no one there, it was just fair game.
The line where the New Zealanders celebrated Christmas in 1944 was not of any particular significance. It was just where the Allied offensive halted through exhaustion. The possibility of a German counterattack was ignored because they were even more exhausted. And because they were suffering such heavy losses on their other fronts, there was no hope of their getting reinforcements. So they had nothing to gain by starting a doubtful venture in the Italian winter. The New Zealanders reorganized to meet the demands of the campaign. The the number of infantry was increased by creating a new brigade, the 9th. With Brigadier Gentry in command, they faced the lacework of rivers and canals in northern Italy. They crossed the Senio River, they crossed the Santerno River, and then the Germans made a last decisive stand.
The German 4th Parachute Division was holding the stop banks on the Guyana River. They were a famous division, and they fought very well indeed, so that we were unable to get more than a footing on the near bank of the stop banks during that day. And we then organized a Cassino-type battle with tremendous artillery support, flamethrowers going up to the stop banks, and the whole machine. The only thing we were worried about was that that was the last real reserve of ammunition that we were able to get hold of, and the Germans could go. If they went before the battle started, there was no more ammunition for a big battle. But fortunately, thanks to Hitler, they had to stick it out where they were, and we gave them such a beating that night that was really the breakthrough. And from then onwards, we had no severe fighting.
They crossed the Po, the last major river, by April the 28th, and were ordered to continue the pursuit of the obviously disorganized German forces.
We had been ordered to capture Padua. Well, the division got forward fairly quickly, without very much fighting, but little actions here and there. And as we were coming up to Padua, one of the Italian liaison officers came up and said that the partisans had already bottled up all the Germans in Padua. So I said to him, look, I wasn't too sure whether what he told me was true. I said, you ride on the leading tank and and we'll see what happens when you get there. So off they went, and it was quite true. The partisans had bottled up 5,000 Germans.
The partisan uprising had done more than that. All the Alpine passes were blocked to German traffic. Mussolini and his mistress were shot at Lake Como, and in an anti-fascist sweep, and one suspects some personal vendettas, they also shot anyone thought to have had any fascist leanings. After taking Padua, the division learned that Venice too was in Italian partisan control. And although it wasn't within his orders, Freyberg dispatched a company of New Zealanders for the sole purpose of commandeering the Albergo Danieli Hotel, reputedly the best in Venice, for the New Zealand Forces Club. The decor was exactly as one would expect in such an hotel. And the comforts were just those required for battle-weary troops. The cuisine served by Italian waiters was considered by the general as only befitting his men. As always, Freyberg was making sure they had the best of everything.
It's about that time that we were told that our next objective was to get to Trieste for good political and military reasons.
After the peace negotiations of World War I, Italy had annexed Trieste and the surrounding country as her prize of war from the defeated Austrian Empire, much to the annoyance of the newly created state of Yugoslavia. Now, with his Yugoslav partisan army fast approaching the disputed area in April 1945, Tito, the leader, saw military occupation and final annexation as his prize of war. This idea was repugnant to the Western Allies, but they could only dispute the claim by their own military presence.
We went very quickly And when we got to Monfalcone, of course, we first came into touch with the Yugoslavs, but the commanders on the spot had no real instructions about what to do. They depended entirely on orders from Belgrade.
The Yugoslavs were surprised by the speed of the New Zealanders' advance and obviously disgruntled by their presence. But in the face of such force, they could only resort to bluff. In growing tension, the New Zealanders sped on to Trieste and final political confrontation.
I suppose grim's the best word to describe their attitude. Had a very hard time, of course, but they went around armed to the teeth, and after years of campaigning, there was nothing light-hearted about them at all. But when you read the story of what they'd had to put up with, you could understand it, but it didn't make it any easier to become friends. It was rather a silly and almost infantile business, really. They'd come along and poke a gun at my headquarters, and we'd poke a couple of guns at them and they'd go away. And there were demonstrations of troops marching through the place armed to the teeth, but it died down, and General Morgan was sent by General Alexander to see Tito, and they came to an arrangement for the Yugoslavs to retire from Trieste to a line a few miles east of the city. And round about the 21st of May, that came to pass. Actually, when they didn't retire, we just moved our troops up to that line.
War with Germany ended in Italy on the 2nd of May 1945, followed 5 days later by their complete, unconditional surrender to the Allies. But these celebrations went almost unnoticed by the New Zealanders, entangled in a trying political situation. For 3 months, the division occupied Trieste and the surrounding country for the United Nations, and faced with understanding and tolerance the first post-war ideological differences. For our troops in Europe, the war was over, and their one idea was to get home. In the New Zealand Division's 5 years fighting through North Africa, Greece, Crete, Italy, it had suffered well over 21,000 casualties. Of these, over 15,000 were wounded and 5,624 killed in action.